Welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. We're going to be talking and taking a quick dive into the basics of whole farm planning. So this is not designed to be a surrogate for a multi-day course, which AgVic would typically run, but it's just designed to introduce the concepts to you so that you can have a think about how you might do a whole farm plan on your own property. Now, what we're going to do, I've got a bit of an outline coming up. I'll just start working through. First of all, I'd like to do a welcome to country, or an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathering today, and we recognise their continued connection to the land and the waters of the beautiful northeast of Victoria. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I think it's quite appropriate, given that we're looking at whole farm planning and how to look after our natural assets, that we do the acknowledgement of country first. All right, so first screen, just an outline of what we're going to cover today. First of all, what is whole farm planning? What are some of the planning considerations that you need to look at in the process of developing a whole farm plan? What is the process behind whole farm planning? What responsibilities do you have as a landholder? What are your statutory responsibilities and to your neighbours? And when to seek permission for works that you might be doing on your property. So just very broadly, whole farm planning is the process of planning, design and managing your property with consideration of three key factors. And I think that's productivity, so a focus on productivity, focus on natural resource management, and also economic considerations and factors. So the objective really is to come up with a plan that addresses all of those three objectives to allow you to manage your property in a better way. So what is a farm plan itself? So a farm plan is just a plan to help you simplify the management and improve your productivity on your property, and weaving in those considerations around protection of natural assets on your farm and to help with decision making on your farm. And particularly that could be in times of drought when food might be short, and there's also considerations around water scarcity as well. So plans can be short term or long term. And maybe what you might have is a very long-term plan for your farm, which you can break into shorter annual plans of what you might do over a 12-month period. I think one of the key things to think about is that everyone's plans will be different, because everyone's goals and visions for their property is likely to be different. So there's not a one-size-fits-all with a whole farm plan. It is very individual, and it comes down to what you would like to achieve on your property and what your product, what your property is like, whether it's got lots of native veg or it's mostly geared for agricultural production. So everyone's plans will be different, and they will change over time, and they might change because your needs change, or because your goal for your property changes, or maybe with the changing climate, with water getting more scarce. If stream flows are going to drop by 30%, you might need to look more carefully at water availability on your property. So the plans will change, and they might need to be reviewed over time and amendments made. So I tried to put together a list that was not too big, but some of the possible components that you need to consider when you're developing your farm plan. And this is drawn from Agriculture Victoria's website. So some of the geographic considerations are, what's the topography like across your catchment, so or across your property, so where your hill sites are or your floodplain sites. What's your variation in soils across your property? What water supply you have, and if you have a reticulation system, you would usually map that. What are the natural assets? So from a biodiversity point of view, do you have remnant vegetation? Do you have waterways? Do you have wetlands? Pest, plant and animals. So if there are specific issues around particular pest animals, so hares or rabbits or deer, that would help be something that you would include in your plan. the condition and type of pastures across your property. And then some of the other things you can think about are succession planning, grazing management, so how you move your stock across your property, any particular flood prone or wet areas that might need to be separated out in a different management regime, consideration of drought management, so where you have your reliable water in summer and particularly during drought, and whether you might have a stock containment area or a sacrificial paddock where you will put your dry feed out. Consideration of bushfire planning and clear areas around your infrastructure, such as your sheds and your houses. And then all of this sort of goes in. So you're looking at what your assets are on your property, what the threats might be. So that might be a pest, plants and animals, or water. And that helps you prioritize your works across your frontage. So it's really set up to help you develop realistic plans for progressing and improving your property over time. So in terms of planning considerations, these are something that are driven by your local government area. So for us, typically up here, we've got the rural city of Wangaratta or Indigo Shire, Alpine Shire, Benalla Shire. So the planning considerations are managed individually by the shires, and there's a planning schemes online that you can look at that shows all of the zones and the map zones for all of the land in Victoria. So you can have a look and see what your particular property is zoned as. So typically it might be farm zone. And you can also then check whether there are overlays that are specific to your property, which might inform what you can and can't do on certain areas of your property. So the typical overlays that we would need to consider as landholders would be a vegetation protection overlay. If you have significant vegetation type that may need protection, that would be identified. If you have land that sits within a floodway, so that is normally on our larger permanent waterways, so like the King River or the Ovens River. If you've got a land subject to inundation area, that will be on potentially the broader floodplain or in some of our ephemeral creek systems. If you're in a bushfire management area, and there may also be an Aboriginal heritage overlay. They tend to follow waterways as well. So often if you've got the floodway and the land subject to inundation, you've probably got an Aboriginal heritage area listing as well. But there can be other sites included in that overlay specific to different areas. So it's worth having an understanding for your particular property of what your planning zone is and then what overlays might apply to it. So how do we make a start? I think that the first step is really to print off an aerial map of your property. So if you're lucky, you might be able to get a grant through your local land care group and get a printed and laminated plan developed for your place. Otherwise, you might be able to use some aerial imagery off Google Earth and get something printed down at Officeworks that you can use as a base map. So the idea being that if you can laminate that map, you can then use the map to map different layers across your property. So when Agriculture Victoria run a whole farm planning course, they will usually give you a few clear sheets of acetate that you can lay over the top of your aerial photography. And typically what they do is on the first layer, they'll say, mark up all your existing assets. So that will be things like your fences and your yards and your reticulation system for your troughs and all of that. And then they might give you another sheet and say, okay, come up with, if you're thinking about redoing some fencing, let's map what we think that we'd like, and that becomes your bit of your future plan. So you can do that using acetate, but you can also do it using whiteboard markers of different colors. And if you use markers, whiteboard markers, they can be just rubbed out with, a tissue, or otherwise on a laminated map, you can use a permanent marker and just use a bit of metho if you need to take it off down the track. So that's a really good practical way to start your planning process. So once you gather some of that information about the existing features on your property, the next big thing to consider is what's your goal or your vision, or what would you like to achieve for your property? And that is going to be different for everybody. So coming up with a statement and some ideas around what you want to do on your property. And that leads into the fourth step. Okay, let's come up with the overall plan. So if we say we're going to manage our property for biodiversity, well, let's look at what the assets are on our property and, you know, how we protect them or enhance them. If we were managing because we had a goal around productivity and we looked at it and we went, okay, so we know we've identified that shade and shelter is really important. Let's look at each paddock and see if we've got the shade and shelter that we need. Okay, that paddock doesn't have it and that paddock doesn't have it. That sets us on a path towards developing a plan for growing shade and shelter. So the idea being is that then you can break it into a series of actions by year and season, and you can start to put some rough costs around the time that you might need to do them and the costs involved in implementing some of those actions. So it becomes a very practical list of things that you'd like to do and some rough back of the envelope calcs associated with those costs. So this is an example of a typical A1 laminated plan. We would mark up, for example, the yellow just represents the boundary of the property. There's a light blue line, which is the waterway layer, which will pick up any drainage lines that run through the property. And we identified at the time, these were the only existing fences on this large property, just in this bottom right corner. So we popped them in, and these were a couple of re-veg areas where we established some blocks of trees in year one of our plan. So something that can be added to all the time. And I think having a map is a really key starting point. So once you've got that map, like we saw on the previous page, let's go through in detail. So when we look at topography, the sorts of things that we look at identifying are the wet areas, the sloping parts of our sites and our property, aspect, so what faces north, what faces south. You might look at elevation, that might define plant choice a little bit. And if you've got ridges that may be bare of cover, we'd be looking at that too. So next thing, soils. You can have a bit of a search online and look at land classing as a term, and there's an abundance of information online that discusses land classing, but basically it's around breaking up your property into similar types of land that will be managed in the same way. And soil type is a really big defining element to working out what that land can hold. So separating hill slopes from flat, you know, potentially puggy floodplain areas, for example, would be a very basic, you know, break in land classing. And then you can look at conditions. So if you've got sites that are eroding or sites that are highly saline, they would be separated out again. Identifying the natural features, existing remnant vegetation, waterways, wetlands, particularly old paddock trees that might have a lot of hollows that you want to protect. All of those, if you have any areas of wildlife that are hotspots on your property, you would identify them at this point. Farm assets are all our built, constructed things that we have on our property that are important. So pump sheds, fences, dams, buildings, roads, lanes, yards. It could be, you know, power lines, all of those things you would mark. Wildlife habitat areas we've talked about. Areas that you use on your property that have specific uses. So if you have shade blocks or particular lambing or calving areas, or if you have a paddock that you use for feeding, you know, in the dry times where you're happy to bring in, you know, potentially dry feed that's got weed in it and it's, you know, it's not pasture that you're trying to preserve. Those sorts of areas, pest animals and weeds we've talked about, and pasture that we touched on earlier. So, you know, you might break your areas up into, if you've got particular areas of flares versus ryegrass, then you might identify those on here too. When we come to the second point, which was setting our visions and goals, I think the really big thing for everyone to consider is to be really realistic when you look at what your available time is to complete works on your property. So a lot of us work off farm, and we might have, you know, a full-time job as well as managing a farm. And rather than take on too much, it's important to bite off a little bit each year that we know that we can achieve, that we can feel good about and actually get through. So having a think about your available time and your financial resources is really important. And I think just the two key things that I think help people to think about their property and what they would like to achieve from it is, what view would you like from your front veranda? So when you look out over your property at the moment, you know, are there particular areas that you like, that you would like to see more of? Or are there areas that you go, oh, you know, that blackberry is just so out of control, you know, I've really got to make a plan to tackle that. So thinking about what would you like to see, and also how do you want to pass your property on? Like if you're going to be leaving your property to your children, what sort of condition or how would you like to leave it? So they're just a couple of the key things to think about when you're setting that overall vision and goal. Often we like to think really tunnel vision about things. We think, right, well, this is a farm and my focus is productivity, so this is what I want to achieve. Or I'm a lifestyler and I have 10 acres and I'm happy to give all of that over to biodiversity, so this is what I want to do. Or I don't really know what I want to do on my property, but it's really important to me that I like the look of it, which is the amenity, and how am I going to manage that? So we tend to think of these as different objectives, but I think in most cases they nearly always overlap and they can be acted upon. So for example, if you decide you're going to protect that wet area around your farm dam to stop the cattle pugging it up, you can also do works quite cleverly to really make that a hotspot for habitat and for biodiversity, and make it a really enjoyable area that you can use. You might go down and have a picnic, or you put the canoe on the lake, or go down and have fish. So if we're smart about coming up with these goals for both the sites and the property, often we can make good choices and allow all those objectives to happen at once. So the next step is really to identify what your future needs are. So if you've thought about what you want to achieve on your property, the next step is really to think about, okay, do I have all those aspects here to be able to provide and to work towards that goal? Or are there things I'm going to need to do? So are there uses, you know, am I short a lambing paddock or a calving paddock, or do I need more shade from my stock? You know, what don't I have? Are my yards working for me, or do I need to redo the fencing around those? If I'm going to, you know, if my objective is biodiversity and I've got a beautiful remnant block up the back and a corridor down at the road, well, maybe I need to plant something that links the road reserve with that remnant block up the back. And then it can also include things like your built assets. So, you know, these are all my fences stock proof and in good condition, or am I going to need to replace some over time, in which case it gives me an opportunity to change the layout or how I might rebuild those fences. So there are a lot of things that you can identify as the future needs, and then that's what leads us through to working out what the actions are that we need to do on our property. So I've just popped a few photos in to trigger some thoughts. So shade and shelter for stock. Paddock trees are a really obvious one, but they take a really long time to get to this size. And if we're not replacing them and we're losing them with old age or with storms or with dieback, you know, what's our plan B? So do I need to start, you know, planting some shelter belts or fencing some of my waterways to provide corridors that will give shade in the adjacent paddock? If my objective is habitat, you know, where are the key areas of habitat on my property? So if I've got really old hollow bearing trees, then protecting them would be a first priority. And if we're considering food for wildlife, well, birds, mammals, insects, reptiles, they all have different needs. So things like fallen timber on the ground are really important for insects. And then in turn, that really draws in the bird and the reptile population to some of those sites. So thinking in layers about whether we've got the food to address the groups of animals that we'd like to encourage to our property. A really big one is connectivity. And I did mention it before when we were talking about, say, a remnant block up the back. So the slide on your screen here has got some really definite corridors that run along the road reserves. And then there's a waterway, which is actually 15 Mile Creek, that wiggles away on the right-hand side of the screen. And then we've got these big blocks of remnant vegetation up the back. So when we start to look at sites like this, if we've got little drainage lines that run down, you know, through some of these dams that then connect in with, you know, the road reserve, they form really logical places to develop corridors or shelter belts to help with both productivity and biodiversity on your property, because you're achieving multiple objectives with the one site. So having a think about how the layout of the landscape works as a whole can sometimes give you some really good ideas about how to site project sites on your property. And amenity, so the really big, beautiful trees or that wetland that you might have, or the billabong or the farm dam that you love, like what can you do to improve and protect that for future generations? So if that's something that's important to you with your property, then starting to have a think about those assets and how you can protect them or enhance them might be your goal. So often lots of joint outcomes if we're smart about designing our sites. So this particular site was just fenced to protect this big yellow box. So we're also very happy to set aside some land for shrubs so that we're trying to make this a real bird hotspot. It's close to the farm dam, and this was just the first year of planting, and more planting has happened. But the idea being that we've got a really big old resource being the paddock tree. We're excluding stock from around the base to protect the health of that tree. It still projects shade into the next paddock, so stock still utilise the shade, but we've also established a big patch of quite tight shrubs for habitat for birds. So really positive, achieving multiple objectives with the one site. So often it's really hard to know where to start on your property, and we can get a bit lost with what do we do first and how do we do it and what can we consider. And I think this guide that's been put together by the Sustainable Farms team from ANU, so the Australian National University in Canberra, is just a really simple, basic way to get your head around it and to start to think about, okay, this is giving me 10 ideas of ways I can improve the natural assets on a farm. And I've listed for you here all of the types of natural assets that it considers. And I think that when we're wanting to improve, you know, the assets on our property, they automatically have a flow through in terms of productivity benefits. So this is just a really simple way, and they call it the natural asset protection approach. And I think it forms a really good basis for looking where to start if you haven't, you know, delved into this sort of whole farm planning and sort of thinking about what you can do on your property. So you can see, you know, talks through rocky outcrops, shelter belts, pastures, farm dams, and the 10th step here is actually around making a plan. And I'll just give you the example that they give. So is pretty much the same concept that we've just talked through. So starting from scratch with what do you have now? So you can see on this particular plan, they've labelled their fences, gates are shown in red, remnant vegetation patches or single paddock trees are identified, and we've highlighted all our farm dams. This is actually a rocky outcrop on the top of a ridge up here. So, you know, even if it's just a bit of a sketch of your property, that's a really great starting point. And then it might be then that you can sit down and start to think of some of the actions that you might like to do to enhance what you already have. So, for example, you know, number 7 might be enhance the understory in those remnant trees so that you get a really nice tight patch for woodland birds. Number 8 might be develop this shelter belt running north-south so that you get really good afternoon shade when the sun's setting in the west in this paddock. Number 11, you know, protecting a remnant paddock tree and fencing outside the drip zone. And you can see that they've actually left the fence on the southern side. So because the dominant wind in this particular property comes from the north, so any seed off that tree is blown and deposited on the south. So they're actually trying to exclude stock to encourage natural regeneration around that paddock tree. Number 12 down at the bottom end of the paddock was actually to plant some new trees, new paddock trees to form stepping stones across to this larger paddock tree. Enhancing farm dams through here. more shelter belts on the west. So it starts to take shape when you start to look at all the individual components and how they may fit together. And that's just an example of a number of those type of activities that we've talked about. So when it comes to thinking about your responsibilities as a landholder, I thought it was good to just touch on a few key things. So surface water and groundwater, you do have a say in what happens, I guess, to both the quantity and the quality of the water, because you're part of a broader catchment. So here where we are in Northeast Vic, our water, flows down the King and the Ovens rivers and ends up down in the Murray, down at Bundalong, and then that water continues to flow all the way down and out to sea at South Australia. So the water that flows past our door goes on to help numerous communities, and forms part of Adelaide's water supply all the way out. So Northeast Vic contributes like 38% of water to the Murray-Darling Basin. So we are very fortunate to have a lot of good quality water, but we are part of that broader catchment. So being smart about how we use our surface water and groundwater is really important. I think from a safety point of view, it's really important to ensure that your boundary fences are stock proof. So particularly if there is a fire, really good idea, for example, to have your boundary fences with steel posts so that they're not going to burn in a fire, or your stock's not going to be out on the road. So thinking about always maintaining and keeping those boundary fences in good condition to avoid your stock wandering onto the road, causing an accident or going through to your neighbour's place is really important. As a landholder, you have a responsibility for managing weeds, so pest plants, and also pest animals on your property. And particularly that could be, if you don't want those weeds to spread across to your neighbour, and I'm sure their neighbour doesn't want to spread weeds to you. So everyone has that obligation to manage them, and same as council look after the roadside weeds. So if everyone can work together as a team to manage those, then everything goes along a lot more smoothly. Management of fuel loads is a really big one, and we're going to see it this year as being a prime consideration, just because we've had an amazing winter and spring. We've got a lot of grass on roadsides and in paddocks. So they can, if it's something like phalaris that might be a metre high and quite thick, that can represent a bit of a fire risk. So having a think about your responsibilities in terms of managing those loads and how you might slash or when you might graze to keep those down in key areas of your property. And a big one is to consider your neighbours. So if you're planning on planting a shelter belt and your neighbour has this perfect view of Mount Buffalo in front of their place, it's probably not a great spot to put in, the tallest of trees. So just thinking about, being neighbourly and how you can go about your activities and not impact on some of those other considerations is really important. So when do we need to seek permission? So there are a couple of times when you're going to be doing work on your property that you might need to get in touch with local government or another organisation for approval. So I think I've identified 3 things. So the first is native vegetation removal. So our local council administers that on behalf of the Government of Victoria. So native veg is classed under the Act as plants that are Indigenous to Victoria, and they include trees and shrubs, which is obvious, but they also include the herbs and grasses that are on the ground layer. So when we have a ground layer that comprises more than 25% native herbs and grasses, that actually triggers the Native Veg Removal Act, and you would actually need to have a permit to actually change the structure of that vegetation. So there are lots of exemptions for different types of activities. So things like replacing fences, putting in new fences, zones around your buildings for bushfire management, ecological thinning. So if you get a big patch of red gum come up in a clump and you want to thin that out, there are some exemptions that you can apply for, but it is worth getting in touch with council to check whether you do need a permit, and that then would alleviate you being accidentally fined after the event. The second thing here is a Works on Waterways permit through the North East Catchment Management Authority. So The North East CMA are responsible for river health right across the northeast of Victoria. And the types of works that you would typically need a permit for is anything that involves the modification of the bed or the banks of the waterway. So if you wanted to put in a new bridge or a new crossing, a new culvert, you wanted to batter some banks on your property, or change a particular bank alignment or anything like that, you would need to get in touch with the CMA. Now, there used to be a fee for applying for a Works on Waterways permit, but it's free now. And the idea is that the CMA would like to encourage everyone to come forward so that they can work with them to come up with a plan that is appropriate for those sites. So it only applies to designated waterways, and that means that they're like creeks and rivers that have been defined as a waterway. Generally, if they're shown on a 1 to 25,000 map, then you would need a permit to do any works on them. So you can ring them, and there's maps that can be inspected at the offices up in Wodonga, and you can give them an address by email as well and just say, look, do I need to have a permit for this? And I just encourage anyone that would like to do something on their waterway to get in touch, because the CMA can provide some guidance around doing those activities in the safest manner to give you the best outcome from your property, but also to look after the health of the waterway as well. And the third area where I think that it's worth thinking about is works on a dam, and a permit for that would come through Golden Murray Water. Golden Murray Water are the organisation that's responsible for anything to do with the taking and using of water in our local area. So that can be surface water or groundwater. So anytime we actually extract water out of a system to use, then Golden Murray Water become the referral authority for that. So generally, if you just need to clean out the dam and you're not changing the size of the dam, that would be considered maintenance. That's okay. But if you're planning on enlarging and modifying a dam or building a new dam, then you would need to get in touch with Golden Murray Water and go through the approval process to get a permit to do that. So unfortunately, the definition of what a waterway is different for those two authorities. So it is worth touching base with both of them and clarifying whether or not you do need a permit. So that's been a pretty quick run through of the basics of whole farm planning. It's a lot of information in a short space of time, but I hope it gives you some insight into the sorts of things that you might need to consider. So I think as a wrap up, what my take home message for you is the first task is really about gathering information and understanding what you have on your property, and then thinking about your goals of what you would like as a vision or a series of objectives for your place, and then to mark that up either in a written format, on a sketch, or on an aerial photo. There's sort of the general options. Mark up your plan, and then that might be an overall plan, and then each year pull off a couple of actions that you're happy to achieve off that and work through them, and plan, keep sort of looking at that plan regularly. Like if you've got the big A1 map, pop it on the wall in the shed and come back to it and see how things are tracking, and review it over time. And as your needs change, or certain assets might change on the property, plan to review it and update it every year, I think is a really good way to look at it. So that was all from me. I'm